This is Gene Monterastelli, and welcome to the Tapping Q&A podcast, recorded live to tape from Williamsburg in Brooklyn. This is episode 268, originally aired April 26th, 2017. Hi, everyone. I hope this finds you well wherever you are and whatever time of day you're getting a chance to listen to this. Thanks for spending some time with me today. Today, we're going to talk about limiting beliefs we have about ourselves and beliefs we have about the world that aren't useful and how they prevent us from having the life that we want, and a really simple process that you can follow to tap along to clear them. Before we do that, I want to thank Linda. Linda is the most recent person who has chosen to support the Tapping Q&A podcast. You can do that by going to tappingqa.com/support. If you happen to be listening to this in the website, link is right above the player. If you're listening to this in a podcatcher, if you go into the notes section, you will see a link where you can click that. If you do decide to support the podcast, you get some awesome thank you gifts, and we have some great things planned once we reach certain levels of support. All of the information at tappingqa.com/support. Also, if you have not done so already, I have a free 10-part guide that you can use tapping to eliminate self-sabotage in your life. There are audios, there's videos, there's scripts, there's instructions. It's really easy for you to get. All you need to do is go to tappingqa.com, click on the big blue button. If you're listening to this audio and the website right now, if you go up the right-hand sidebar up at the top, you'll see a blue button. Click on that. And every few days, you'll get another one of those pieces, which will make it easier for you to implement. So I'm not overwhelming you with information and throwing at you all at once. You get a little at a time, and it is spooled out in a way that is easy to digest. Today's podcast is a little bit different. It is a recording of a presentation that I gave at the Spring Energy event, which happened last weekend. The Spring Energy event happens every single year in the spring, usually around New York City. It's an amazing event. Go to springenergyevent.com to get more information and to get on the mailing list. So when future events happen, you can come along. It was a great weekend, a number of awesome presenters, great fellowship. Transformation was happening. It was a good time, and it was had by all. The presentation I gave was a new presentation for me. It's been something that has been running around in my head for quite a while, but this is the first time it's really landed, and it gave me an excuse to really think through the idea in detail. We are impacted by the beliefs that we have about ourselves and the beliefs we have about the world. And much of the work that I do with my clients is clearing those unuseful, inaccurate, or limiting beliefs. So in this presentation, what I do is I talk about how we build those beliefs over our lifetime, and then a very simple tapping protocol that you can follow once you've identified them to clear them. And the protocol itself actually teaches you how to uncover the belief if you aren't exactly sure what that particular belief is. A couple of notes. One is I gave this presentation with a few slides. They weren't super, you won't miss much by not seeing the slides, but know that that is the case. I also gave out a handout that had a front and a back on it. All of the information from the handout, if you're listening to this on the website, can be found directly below the audio player. And if you're listening to this in an application on your smartphone or a tablet, if you go into the notes section from this particular episode, below the information, you'll actually see at the bottom of those notes everything that I'm talking about. As I go through the presentation, I point out 8 operating principles that I work from, and then at the end, I go through the protocol that I use. So both the 8 operating principles, as they were handed out, you'll notice there's some blanks in there, and I had the audience fill it out as we went, so you'll get a chance to do that as well, and the protocol itself. So all of that is included in the show notes. I also edited the talk a little bit for brevity, took out some parts that weren't necessary for the learning. So here is one of my favorite presentations I've given in a really long time on how beliefs are created and how we can identify the ones that aren't useful and how we can tap to release them. I hope you enjoy it. Stylistically and practically, the way that we're going to approach this is a little bit different than what's come before. I'm going to share with you today is my disposition and is my approach.
It is not right. It is not accurate. It is not true. I simply offer it up as an opportunity for you. At any point I say you should, you must, you have to, you have permission to take whatever is in your hand and throw it at me. Because I'm not up here to give you anything that I think is true. I'm just sharing from my experience. And I'm also going to be sharing with you the way that I work and the way that I think. It may be helpful. It may not. Many of you are very intuitive, very empathic. I don't have a heart. I have no idea what that is like. So this is the way I work with clients coming from that point of view. So just bear that in mind. So what we're going to talk about today is we're going to talk about beliefs, self, and action. And the first word up here is really important, belief. Because our emotional response to a circumstance is not impacted by the facts. Our emotional response to a circumstance is impacted by our belief about what the facts are and our belief about what the meaning of those facts are. We can be in a circumstance where someone is acting in the most kind-hearted, goodest, generousest, most way, and we can take it as an attack and as an affront. And we can have people in our life who are being deceptive, deceitful, stealing from us, and we will happily follow them with a smile because of what we believe. So as we're working through this, we're going to be looking at what we believe, how it impacts us, and how we interact in the world. I'm going to do two things simultaneously. I'm going to share with you a story about how I think unfolds, and I'm going to share with you operating principles. These are the fundamentals that shape the way that I do work. And I operate with them as if they are true. Again, they may or may not be, and you don't even have to accept them as true, but it gives me a framework so that when something comes up, I have a starting point. Because again, I work through things, I'm a former computer scientist, I work through things in a really systematic way, and so this is just a framework of what I'm going through. So we're going to go through both of those paths on parallel. I'm going to tell you a story, and I'm going to give you these techniques, these principles. Then at the end, what we're going to do is we're going to talk about an actual tool that I use that you could use if you would like to approach this particular problem. So, operating principle number 1 on your worksheet right there. We always make the best choices based on the information we have and the resource state that we are in. We always make the best choice that we can make based on the information we have and the resource state that we're in. I find this really valuable when working with myself and working with my clients, because typically when we are beating ourselves up about a choice that we made or we didn't make, we're in a different resource state and we have a different set of information because we're on the other side of it. I learned this really valuably when I was teaching anger management in the county jail, and my guys talked about making one decision right here and another decision right here, because their resource state and their information changed literally as they were throwing a punch. And it gave them the opportunity sometimes to make a different choice and sometimes not. Because in a fighting circumstance, if I hit you in the chin, it's assault, and I hit you on the wall, it might be attempted assault, and it's probably vandalism. And for someone who has already been convicted of something, that could be the difference in years. Literally 6 inches of whether or not I make contact or not. And so recognizing the fact that when we are helping ourselves and helping our clients to see where we are is to recognize the difference between the information and resource state we have now looking back and the information and resource state that we were in. And if we're able to do that, I have found it's much easier for me to be generous and charitable with myself as I'm trying to navigate and work my way through all of that stuff. Now, this does not mean that we are not responsible for the outcome because of the resource state we were in that moment. I'm still responsible for those choices, but there's a difference between me being responsible for that choice and me being that. Or me being responsible for that choice and me always having to be that. It was an action that I'm responsible for. It is not a defining characteristic of who I am as I move forward. Operating principle number 2. The goal is to have well-informed, proportional emotional responses. The goal is to have well-informed, proportional responses. And again, I learned this lesson really valuably from my guys in jail because literally, and I'm actually going to use the word literally correctly here, there were guys in my class who literally were alive because of their anger. Their anger gave them the strength to fight out of dangerous situations. And if they didn't have that anger, it would be a problem. Now, one of my guys was incarcerated because he was a vet. He had fought in Desert Storm, and he was at a gas station, and there was a person in front of him who had a bumper sticker, and the bumper sticker said, "The U.S. military is the real terrorists." He ended up beating up the man right there. It was a gas station. There were 4 cameras there. The entire thing was caught on tape. There's 18 months in jail. It was a second offense because of some other things that had happened. So in that circumstance, it is fair to say that is not a proportional, well-informed response. And so when we're working with ourselves and we're working with clients, the goal is never to be emotionless. When I'm standing in the middle of the street and a car is bearing down on me, it is good that I feel fear. I don't want to be standing in the intersection going, ooh, 67 Mustang. I love 60s Mustangs. But we want it to be proportional. It's great that I'm scared of tigers, and if I never leave my apartment in Brooklyn because there's a tiger in the Bronx Zoo, that is not proportional. And so as we're doing this work and we're coming to the place of the beliefs that we have, and we're coming to the responses that are there, the goal is to make sure that we have a well-informed belief that we are then responding to in a proportional, emotional way. And so when I'm getting feedback from my own life, when I'm working with my clients, that's what I'm trying to assess. What happened? What's the belief that is there? Is that a useful belief? And then once we get there, is it a proportional emotional response? And sometimes we can have an inaccurate belief and a disproportionate emotional response. And so it just, again, it's giving us an insight as a way to kind of systematically approach what's going on. Now, the story I am about to share with you, this is not theology, and this is not biology. Okay? This is just a metaphor. It is a useful metaphor for me when I'm trying to understand what I'm dealing with and where a belief comes from. And as a useful metaphor, it has been helpful as I work with clients. So it doesn't matter if it's actually true, but because it's describing a circumstance in a specific way, it gives me insight into what's going on. So in the beginning, we are this perfect little piece of light. And in some way, again, not going to get into theology, we get broken off in a partial way from the whole. And we exist in just absolute perfection. And at some point, we land in a physical body that starts to develop. And in that instance, we are given DNA and we are given genetics. And that DNA and that genetics, as Harry talked about yesterday, informs who we are and how we interact in the world. And one of the things that we're recognizing more and more in evolutionary biology is there's this idea of G plus E, genes plus environment, which create particular outcomes that are dictated by our genes. For example, there is a particular gene that if you have it and you are breastfed for the first 9 months of your life, it makes about a 10-point difference in your IQ. Now, being breastfed for the first 9 months of your life does not generate this. Having that genetic component does not generate it. It's the combination of the two. So every single one of us were dealt a slightly different genetic hand at the beginning. Even though we came from this perfect little thing that was just, now we're a little bit distinct. And this distinctness is going to impact the way we move through the world because our environment is impacting our genome, and it impacts the way that we perceive our experience. So it becomes this useful thing. Then, operating principle number 3. We learn rules, pattern, and cause and effect relationships because it is fuel efficient. I'll say that again. We learn rules, pattern, and cause and effect relationships because it is fuel efficient. The intelligence of any creature on this planet, we'll put intelligence in quotes here, the intelligence of any creature on this planet is determined by neural density in the brain. And so when we look at these animals that we think are super, super elevated, like maybe us, dolphins, there's this really high neural density, which is great because it gives us so many more circuits to process, so much more information to remember, so many more things to make us more efficient as we move through the world. And that takes a lot of energy to power this thing. It takes so much energy to power this thing. And they did this really interesting study with rats when they were learning about habits. And they were able to just stick little electrodes into the back of their brain to track what was going on. And they put them in a maze, and they put chocolate in the exact same spot in the maze every single time. And the first time they went into the maze, they wandered around, and they wandered around, and they wandered around, and they did that. There was all this brain activity. It was taking all of this energy. And they went in the next day, and it happened again. And they went in, it became a habit for them. They got into the maze, they walked to the chocolate, and there was no brain activity. It took no energy at all because they knew the path to take. And so we are these pattern-making, lesson storytelling machines. When I get into the rental car, I don't have to check and see which is the brake and which is the gas. I have a pattern for that. I sit down in the restaurant, and a glass that looks like this is placed in front of me. I don't test its temperature. I don't see if it's vodka or turpentine. I'm in a restaurant, I assume it's cold water. Now, I could be wrong, but I do that because it takes so much less energy for me to do that. Our ability to have novel thought and to discern things is a limited resource every single day. And every single time you make a new choice, you've spent a little bit of that resource. That's the reason why if you decide to go on a diet, breakfast is really easy and dinner is really hard. Is because through the day you've made all of these novel choices, and so you have less energy to make a good choice. It's the reason why when you travel someplace new, the first 3 days of the vacation feel like they take an entire week, and the last 7 days go by like this. It's because you now know the neighborhood that the hotel is in. You know the coffee shop that you're going to go to. You know how to get back to the hotel from the city square. And you've quickly learned these patterns. And so since it's not novel, it's not taking in our energy. And since it's not novel, you're not remembering it. And so each time we have a novel experience or we have a novel thought, it costs us energy. So we create these patterns. But as we know, just because we've created a pattern doesn't mean it is a useful pattern. But it's a pattern we go to because our system is trying to save energy so that when we get to a place where we have to have that energy to have thought, we've saved it. It's kind of the end of this. I oftentimes do a workshop with high school students called No One's Ever Made a Good Choice at 3 o'clock in the morning. We are in this world physically, and we are now impacted by the vessel that we are carried in. You know, the biochemistry that our birth mother has starts to impact us. We're in a circumstance where we are perceiving, though muted, information from the outside. And in this process, we're starting to create these patterns and we're starting to create these stories. So first we had these stories that show up in our DNA. Now we have these stories and patterns that show up from this very, very primitive experience. I don't know if you've ever had a client when we're going back and trying to root causes land in utero. It happens. Because those are memories that are happening. Now, we might not remember them. We talked about this a little yesterday. Some have lots of early memories. I don't have a great deal of them. But it's impacting and it's informing and it's creating those patterns. We're these pattern-making machines that make the world a way to navigate. Operating principle number 4. Fear is our genetic heritage. Thousands and thousands of years ago, our ancestors were walking along the savannah, and a lion showed up. And two of our ancestors were standing next to each other, and both of them had their fear response go off because of the lion. At that particular moment, it does not matter if you were faster than the lion. You only need to be faster than the person standing next to you. And so these two people standing there had a fear response go off. And there was probably a microscopic split-second difference in who felt fear faster. And the one that felt fear faster got away, the one that didn't got eaten, and the one that felt fear faster was the one that procreated. And it happened generation after generation after generation. The same is true as they walked along and they saw these giant paw prints in the sand and were able to go pattern, paw prints, big fuzzy thing with teeth. And so the one that was able to write the story most efficiently was the one that survived. So with each passing generation of our species, very minusculely, very microscopically, each generation got better and better at writing these stories and responding to fear. Now again, that's fabulous if it is a well-informed, proportional response. And because of what fear is, it overrides everything else that you were experiencing in that moment. You know, if someone opened the back door and started screaming about a fire out there, no matter how charming you think I am in this particular moment, your attention is going to go back there. Because that is our genetic heritage. And so again, as we're looking at these beliefs and we're dissecting them, one of the things that we're constantly going back to is, and you'll see this when we go through the process, what is the fear that is there? And then what is the story that is being told by that? It becomes really, really useful. So then we come into this world, and we have this family, and we're in this very impressionable space. One of the things that we do in hypnosis is we try and get folks into a deep enough trance so that we can actually do real work to write information, and we can actually measure the kind of different brainwave frequencies, right, Ted, that we go through, and that's one of the ways that we measure trance. And so we're trying, when we're doing somnambulism, we want to get a very particular one. Do you remember what brainwave that is? Theta. Thank you. The first 6 years of our life, we live in theta. So basically, the first 6 years of our life, it is like being in a deep hypnotic trance where we're constantly writing information to our subconscious mind about how the world works. And again, that's what allows us to learn how to manage this world so quickly, this complicated world. The problem is, without knowing any of you, I have a feeling in your family history and in your family structure, there are probably some stories that were passed along that were not proportional and were not well informed. I'm just guessing that's the case. So these things start showing up, and again, they're informing us, and they're giving us this information. And so it impacts the way we act in the moment. So we get our biology, we get in utero, we get our initial family. Then we wander out into this amazing, amazing world. It's really interesting to see the way that we pick up stuff from the environment around us. Again, going back to this idea that fear is our genetic heritage, very primitively, the reason we formed tribes, part of it was simple survival. That was easier to gather food, to take care of each other, to share information. If you look at any of Bruce Lipton's work, at a biological level, he actually tells the story of how we went from single-celled creatures to multi-celled creatures the exact same way. Basically what happens on the cellular level is the cell has all of these keyholes that peptides go into that give information. So we know if there's food nearby, if there's danger, go by. And as we became more and more sophisticated as single cells, we got bigger and bigger and bigger so we could have more and more keyholes of different types. And at a certain point, the cell membrane broke because it was just too big. And so what happened was one cell would learn how to find food and one cell would learn how to find danger, and they started traveling together and they would share information. And all of a sudden, those cells joined, and they joined, and they joined, and they joined. I mean, think about our bodies. We start as these T cells, and a T cell learns, I'm going to become a kidney cell, or I'm going to become a lung, or I'm going to become a brain cell. And so we learn that when we are outside of the tribe, it is dangerous because we will die. And so it's this really primitive thing that shows up. So these cultural stories that we are told, these cultural patterns that we are given about success, about happiness, about safety, again, we learn these patterns because it's how we think we are going to survive. And again, this is happening at a very subconscious level. So then we have experience in the world. The things that we go out and do. So there's the general cultural stuff, and then there's me living my life, which is a unique life from your life and your life and your life. And we write stories to the experience that happened. We give meaning to the experience we happened. Oftentimes when I'm talking about friends and they're telling me stories about what something means, my response oftentimes, and sometimes a cigar is just a cigar. There is no meaning, there is no story, but it is our disposition to write a story to every single thing that happens. And oftentimes, we can have a story where you don't show up to dinner that I made and I worked really hard on, and I'm angry at you, and eventually I hear from you and you lost your phone and you had a flat tire. Or you were on the 6 train and you were stuck underground for 45 minutes with absolutely no cell service because you couldn't let me know what was going on. I get new information and it gives me a chance to rewrite a story. There are also times we get so attached to our story, even when we get new information, we still stay married to our own story. So all of these things are informing the beliefs that we have. The beliefs that we have inform our emotional response. It's not the facts of the circumstance. It's our emotional response to how we interpret the facts that creates our emotional life. Operational principle number 5. Trauma is created by events that are extreme, unexpected, isolating, in which we perceive, important word, perceive loss of control. Trauma is caused by events that are extreme, unexpected, isolating, in which we perceive loss of control. During one of the bombings in London, people got trapped in the tube system. And if you were doing intake with someone who was trapped in the tube system, they found one question that you could ask someone who was stuck on one of those trains to determine whether or not they experienced PTSD from the experience. The one question that they asked them, and it wasn't like generalized most of the time, but if you only could ask them one question, the question you would ask them was, while you were stuck on the train, were you able to send a text message to the outside and did someone reply? Because at that moment, they were no longer isolated. Now, again, you'll notice isolation had nothing to do with how close they were to people. Because if you've ever been in the London tube system, it makes the New York subway system look like Matchbox cars. I mean, they're just tiny, tiny, tiny things in comparison. And you can be like this inside of them. But they still felt isolated because they had no sense of community and connection to the people around them. And so when we are dissecting and pulling apart these stories that our clients are telling, these become useful lenses to look at through them. And extreme, unexpected, isolating, and control are all relative. It has nothing to do with whether or not they actually were extreme. Because what is extreme for you is not extreme for me, or vice versa. Isolating, again, it has nothing to do with my proximity to people. It has to do with how I'm connected to those people around me. Out of control. Child sees mom in the kitchen. B comes into the kitchen. Mom is flailing madly. Completely out of control for the child. Because now they have no access to the one creature on earth that is keeping them safe inside of that moment. So even though they didn't experience the bee, and it's possible that mom wasn't even afraid of the bee. She was just swatting, trying to get it out of the way. But the perception of that experience is the thing that wrote that story. And so as we're going through and we're working, we're constantly bumping into and trying to find our way to those things. It is unimportant how we pick up the stories and beliefs that we have. And you will notice there's a little asterisk up there in the corner, and we'll come back to that asterisk. But for the most part, when I'm working with a client and we're trying to determine whether or not this belief is useful anymore, and if they want to keep it and what we want to transform it into, it is unimportant where it came from. And there's one caveat to that. Operational principle number 6. Our primary work is to let go of rules, pattern, and cause and effect. Let go of unuseful. Our primary work is to let go of unuseful rules, pattern, and cause and effect relationships. Now you might notice here I didn't use the word true. When I'm working with a client or I'm teaching someone any protocol at all, it's like, well, should I do it this way or should I do it that way? Or when I'm trying it, I find this. When I'm doing my own personal work, the most important question is, how useful is it? Is it working for you? If it's working for you, great, keep doing it. If it's not, let's try something else. But it becomes this issue of use. And I find this useful in doing work because what we're doing is we're removing the necessity of finding universal truth, and we're taking a value judgment away from the belief. It's not a morality. It's not is it right or is it wrong. It's a question of, is it as useful for you? And when we start looking at things in our beliefs in terms of use, it gives us access to this idea of truth. Because from my experience, I am going to find my way to that. So for a really long time, I carried one of those giant pink erasers around in my pocket. And the reason why I carried one of those giant pink erasers around in my pocket, because I recognized my only work was to erase those things that had been given to me that were unuseful. And when I go up here and I erase these things that are unuseful, I find my way back to that thing that is underneath. I mean, the way that I created this is I created color blocks, and I just took them to the opacity of 20% to show you that visually. And when, on Friday night, when Robin was talking about this idea of spontaneous insight that our clients come to, this is what I think is going on. What's happening is we are erasing away the things that are no longer useful, and we see our true selves, and so the truth just comes springing through because it's no longer blocked or it's no longer coming through stained glass. It's just that pure light of insight. And so again, I just let go, let go, let go. Every single time I tapped, literally that's all I thought I was doing. Just letting go of these things that aren't useful, letting go of these things that aren't useful, letting go of these things that aren't useful. And then it made it really easy, again, we'll put easy in quotes, for me to make inspired action. Because for me, the goal of my life isn't to have inspired outcomes, because there's so little I control in this universe. I mean, there's 7 billion people who also happen to have free will in their own mind that aren't contributing to exactly what I want. And so I can't measure my success around that. What I can measure my success around is taking inspired action. Because when I take inspired action, I live a rich, full life where I feel filled up, regardless of what those outcomes are. And oftentimes those outcomes are pretty spectacular. Operational principle number 7. We are notoriously bad eyewitnesses to our own experience. And the reason why we are notoriously bad eyewitnesses to our own experience is because we are storytelling, pattern-making machines. And so when we have an experience, we have to have a storytelling pattern to make it understandable and manageable. It is the reason why any good copywriting class will teach you to write a headline with a question in it, because you want to know what's on the other side. It's the reason why radio and the local news will say the 4 things you need to know about blueberries to be healthy. After the commercial break, we'll tell you the 3 things the city isn't telling you about the water supply. Because there is this gap of information, we do really badly with that. And so since that's the way we think, we write stories all of the time. And at a certain point, we tell a certain story about who we are and why we are so many times we're completely emotional disconnected from it. I'm sure you've been in a circumstance where you've worked with a client and they're telling you a story and you can literally hear in their brain a play button being pushed. Words are coming out of their mouth for the next 7 minutes and they've mentally gone somewhere else. Because this is the story of why I am the way that I am. And so when a client tells me the story about why they are the way that they are, I don't dismiss it and I don't say it's wrong. I say, that's a really fascinating piece of information that I'm going to investigate. Because you are more of an expert in your life than I am. Let's just take it as investigation. Much the same way, if there's a hit and run and the eyewitness says they were driving a 67 red Mustang with California license plates. A good detective is going to look at mid-60s sports cars that are red, that have California license plates, and they're going to broaden their search out a little bit further. And so when my client shows up and they tell me a story about what's going on, it is one data point and it's one really useful piece of information that I'm going to be asking questions about. So it's great. Thank you for sharing. It's one of the reasons why I do a written intake before I do my first sessions, is so that my client gets the opportunity to tell their story. I get a chance to listen to it and I get a chance to consume it in about 1/7 the amount of time it would have taken for us to do it in person on the phone. And I'm able to eliminate the pitfall of them falling into the meaning of that story. Because oftentimes we live out of the place of the meaning of that story and not the actual trauma that exists. And so I'm honoring it, I'm hearing it, and I'm making sure I'm putting it aside so that we're not getting caught in the middle of it. That idea of taking that idea and throwing it out into the lobby, throwing it out into the parking lot so we can get away from it long enough. It's useful and we'll come back to it, but that's all it is. Let's talk about the process itself. This is on the other side of your sheet of paper, the one that you've been taking notes on. I have the whole process written there for you. This is the process that I lead folks through that I find super useful. And again, this came out of me just going back and listening to old tape going, oh my gosh, I do this all the time. Most of the clients I work with, I'm working with them to eliminate self-sabotage. So trying to take action of some sort. Now, it might be, I'm trying to write a book, I'm trying to run a business, or it could simply be, I was working with a client recently who had 20 years of financial documents that she needed to get through. And the rest of her life was perfectly organized and would get physically ill just thinking about these documents. And as we did the work, it was interesting that it wasn't even bad news. It just was scary and overwhelming. And so, for me, my job as practitioner, and this is not the operating principle number 8, but job as practitioner is to help you to take the next action that you want to take. It's not about clearing trauma. It's not about making your childhood happy and pretty. It's not about doing any of those other things. It's about helping you to take the next step. And so if we start from an action-driven place and we find our way to a limiting belief, if we clear that limiting belief, you're going to take the action. Now, in that investigation, we might find a limiting belief that's been handed to you, or we might find, well, when I was 7, I was a prisoner of war. This might not have anything to do with it, but... Really, that just came to your mind out of nowhere. That's fascinating. But by doing it in this fashion, what I'm doing is I am going to the belief, the emotional experience that is in way of the next step. And then once they take that next step, now, there's something there, we clear it. Now, it's possible they still can't take the step because there are 2 or 3 other things there that we didn't see initially that we get. But let's assume we get through enough stuff that they take the next step, and maybe they take the next step and boom. Awesome. Great. Let's talk about practically. And so for me, I always talk strategically first, where I want to make sure that you have everything you need to actually execute that step. Do you have the information? Have you learned how to do this? Do you have the resources? Because we can clear every emotional belief in your life and every wound you've ever experienced, but if you still don't know how to make a website, you're not going to make a website. And so we start strategically. Once that is there, then we find what's in the way, we take the next step. We find what's in the way, we take the next step. And eventually momentum, and we clear things, and life is beautiful. So that's the reason why I say imagine the action you want to take. Because practically when I'm working with my clients, they're showing up because they want to do something different. Eat differently, live differently, clean up a space, become something, whatever it is. So you imagine, and it's not big picture. Typically it's the next action. And it could be create a website, which is a big action, or it could be write my bio for my website, which is a much smaller action. Or make this one phone call to invite a person to joint venture with, a much smaller action. So I have them imagine doing that. The second thing I do, I have them feel in their body what the experience is like. Now, most people it's going to show up in their body, not always. And I say, well, okay, so it could be something you experience in your body, or it might be a chattering in your head or something else. And I give examples. It might be butterflies in your stomach, tightness in your throat, chattering in your head. It might feel like your entire lungs are stuffed with cotton candy. Now, when I'm giving examples, I like using a rule of 3 or 4, where I'm going to give my client an example of possible responses, and the last example I give is always something wacky. So what I'm doing is, in the first 2 responses, I'm teaching them how to tune in, because a lot of my clients have never actually tuned into their body before, and this is a new experience. I'm giving them something wacky so that they don't feel constrained to do what is supposed to feel when you have this emotion. So we feel it in the body. Then I have them ask the physical sensation questions. The reason why or the thought, whatever it is. We'll say physical sensations just for a shorthand in this conversation, because that's it most of the time. And the reason why we ask the physical sensation questions is we are now disassociating their conscious mind from problem solving. So I'm giving them the opportunity to let go of the story that they are telling. And we're now asking the body. And for people who are really new to this, I'll say, hey, just draw a little cartoony face on there for the front, just so we can have a little conversation with it. But what it does is it gets that separation, so now we're getting information from the subconscious mind, not the conscious mind, which in this sort of work is oftentimes significantly more helpful. This is the place where you get the client saying, well, this probably has nothing to do with it, but as a practitioner, that is the single favorite thing a client will ever say to me in a million years. Because if they are surprised by the answer, it means it's going to be a really useful answer, because we've gotten completely away from their conscious mind. Now, it might not be the total solution in the way we need to go, but it is a doorway that is opened up that we would have found no other way. So, fear is our genetic heritage. So the first question we ask it is, what is it afraid of? As a side note with these questions, they might not have answers to all of these questions. That's perfectly okay. And I tell them that when I ask the question and there's a long pause, I'll say, and it's okay if there's no answer. Take your time. We're in no rush. If nothing shows up, we'll move on. So I'm giving them permission to know they're not going to get this wrong, because it is unuseful for me for them to come up with an answer if there isn't one, because it's the right answer. Not about right or wrong. This is just investigation. So what's it afraid of? Now, oftentimes there's something really clear, or lots of things that are really clear. If I do this thing, they're going to say no. If I do this thing, I'm going to be judged. Whatever it is. Just something will come up. Next question. What proof does it have this is true? So this part of their system has a belief. What proof do you have this is true? Now, in this case, one of 2 things are going to happen. One, proof is going to show up. The last time I did it, this is what happened. My mother always said, this is the way things are. Or, I don't really have any proof. Now, when they don't have proof, one of 2 things happens. One, immediately that fear resides. Because they've found their way to this thing, oh, this isn't useful, and immediately they start letting it go. Other times, even though there is no proof, it is still in there and it's not changing. So I just mentioned that as you're doing this, to check in with that to see if that's something that's coming forward that is useful. Now again, these next questions, as you kind of that story I was telling you about the places that we pick up belief, these questions are about this. And these questions are about that asterisk that was next to our little crane saying, it doesn't matter where we picked it up. Because sometimes when we are letting go of a belief, it feels as if we are letting go of the person who gave us that belief. Or we are saying the person who gave us that belief was wrong. Or we are saying, I now choose to stand apart from the tribe that gave me that belief. So when we start getting into these three questions here, that's when it becomes important. It's not important in how it was formed. It's important in our relationship to the belief. Because it's the sense of letting it go. And when we get into the second part, you'll see how we utilize this. So all of these questions, these 5 questions here, these are just information gathering questions. It's just giving me an opportunity to figure out what's going on. As CJ talked about, cutting it down in smaller and smaller and smaller slices, where we're getting a more precise question. All we're doing in this process is we're gathering information, we're gathering information, we're gathering information. Operating principle number 8. As a practitioner, my goal is to be the color of water. As a practitioner, my goal is to be the color of water. And what I mean by this is, in these 5 questions here and what other questions you ask, you are getting information about their worldview and how they tell the story about how they got that belief. So you could be in a situation where past lives are something that you don't believe in at all, and the story that comes forward that they are telling, where that story came from, was in the 1700s, I was a witch and I was burned alive. That one shows up all the time in my client sessions. Witch burned alive, witch burned alive, witch burned alive. And it's oftentimes stories that are showing up where it's someone who is living a truth that is counter to their immediate family. You know, those of you, and it happens very particularly to highly sensitive people and empaths, highly sensitive temperaments and empaths, because you're in a circumstance where you're perceiving information about what is going on in your family system that nobody else sees or no one else is willing to acknowledge. And anytime you bring it up, my friend Catherine Poole tells this great story about drawing a picture of her family and how everybody was a different color, and the kid next to her, after her brother was green, going, "You're weird." And so immediately, she was in a circumstance, she does all this amazing color therapy, and she taught color theory at university, and she's just medical empath. So that's the way she sees the world. She's constantly transforming this information that she's getting from everyone around her into a color palette. That's the way her brain processes this stuff. And she was told it was wrong. Because you're weird. So, it does not matter at this particular moment if past lives exist and the person sitting across from me in the 17th century was a witch and they were burned alive. Instead, it's given me a really useful piece of information about how this belief was built. Someone was one way and it was dangerous for them to be that in the world. So when I show up and I'm having conversations, this is information I am taking as their worldview, and that is all that matters. I am the color of water. I am just reflecting back your worldview, your experience, your vocabulary. Now, this does not mean you have to work with every single person who has every single worldview in the world. Because there are certain people of certain worldviews, and I have a very particular worldview, that even at my best self where I'm trying to be the color of water, I can't completely remove myself from that. And so therefore that person and I just aren't a good fit to work with, and that's perfectly great. Not right, not wrong, it's all about fit, and it's a circumstance where that's not it, and that's not the accurate fit that's there. So as we're going through this process, we're doing that. So how to release it? The first step isn't a necessary step. It can be useful, particularly when we're taking action. Naming the way that we would like to see ourselves in that action can be really useful, but it's not necessary, because sometimes the way that we want to be is that spontaneous insight that shows up after we've cleared stuff away. Sometimes we have a really clear idea what it is, sometimes we don't. So I'll ask, after we've named this belief, and it's like, oh, it sounds like you believe this, or this part of you believes this, and it's acting in that way. And for me, this should have been one of my operating principles, I'm constantly trying to make my issues my allies. Because my issues are trying to keep me safe. Again, they're just disproportionate or misinformed. Number 2 here, these 5 things, this gets back to us being in a place of being able to let it go. And it dovetails into the conversation that has been unfolding about forgiveness. When I tap for this, and I say this, I am not letting go of the person who gave me this belief. Again, I'm stating this out loud so it's easier for us to transform. So I'm making this about letting go of an unuseful belief and picking up a useful belief. This isn't judgment. This isn't truth. This isn't about my relationships. This isn't about my place in the world. It's simply about my relationship to this belief. So I'm not letting go of the people who gave it to me. I'm not saying the people who gave it to me are trying to hurt me. Now, it is possible someone gave us a belief as a way to try and hurt us. So, I'm not saying that's the case. It might be the case, and I'm still open to that. And sometimes we might need to admit that. Because sometimes in cases of abuse, people say things to us specifically to hurt us. And it is okay to admit and acknowledge that. I'm not saying they were wrong for trying to give it to me. In a small percentage of time, it's wrong they were trying to give it to me. In a large percentage of the time, it was a loved one who was just doing the best that they could because of what they were experiencing. They were being the best parent they could because of the model of a parent that they were given. I do this talk as if protocol for surrogate tapping. And I was doing it with one of my clients, and we don't have time to get into the specifics of the tool itself. In the talk about session, it was about his father relationship. He had 45 minutes of things that he needed to share about what he needed his father to hear. Not that he was saying it, but we were tapping through in this visualization. And when we got to the talk as if, and he said, and my father was mentally ill. That was it. Like literally that was all to be said in that particular circumstance. The simple acknowledgement was, my father was working from a resource state that made it impossible to be a good father to me. That was all that needed to be said. Now, sometimes it's a lot more than that they're not wrong for trying to give it to us. We're acknowledging the fact that we are not wrong for picking it up. Again, this is the difference between us in the moment and us looking back at the moment. Because intellectually, I can look at this belief and see it as hogwash, and I've lived with it for the last 40 years, and it's controlled my life for the last 40 years. God, am I stupid? And I'm, fist to the face. So we're recognizing and we're acknowledging that fact. I'm not saying it wasn't useful for them. Sometimes the beliefs that we get from someone else is an operating principle that actually keeps them alive, actually makes the world manageable for them. So we're not saying that it wasn't useful for them, we're just saying it's not useful for me. And again, when I'm tapping, I'm saying all of these things out loud. Like I am leaning into them and I am acknowledging them as I tap through them. Then, what I do is, I tap, I am picking up a new belief that is helpful for me in this moment. So we're just saying, instead, this is what I'm doing. And this last part, letter C, this last part I find so useful. I have the right to pick up the old belief in the future if I decide is useful. Almost never do we pick up that old belief. But again, remember the motivation of the part of our system that is holding on to this belief. It thinks, this is the way I stay safe. This is the way I stay alive. And it doesn't want to let it go. It's one of the reasons why you start having success with tapping and then magically you just stop tapping for that issue. It's because that part of your system has said, the tapping is making me unsafe because I'm letting go of the one tool that is keeping me alive. And it's going from this misperception of what safety is dependent upon, but it's doing it in that way. And so by adding this into the tapping phrases, what we're doing is we're putting that piece of the system at ease. We're just saying, okay, let's just try this. As a team, let's see what happens if we put this down for a little while. And if you decide that that tool is useful again, we can pick it back up. And after doing that, sometimes the insight happens after we've done the insight in there. Sometimes the spontaneous insight happens after the fact. So now we've done all of this. Then I do say, great, take a nice big deep breath for me. Imagine you are taking the action again. What do you notice now? Is it the same? Is it different? And it just becomes a recursive process. It might land in the exact same spot in the body. Great. What's that part afraid of? And I reassure them, it could be the exact same thing or it could be something different. Where does it land in the body? It could be in the exact same place. It could be different. And two things happen. One is, it feels really great. I love client sessions that end 10 minutes early because they are so ready to take action. They are tired of my voice and my face. It's like, I really need to, I'm like, great, get off the phone, go. Like, that's exactly where you need to be. Because that's what we're trying to do. Because when we get to that space where all of that gets washed away, inspired action becomes really, really easy. Because the beliefs that are standing in the way, the stained glass that is shading that light, the blocks that are there are gone. And so inspired action becomes really, really simple. And not only is it the right type of action, it's the right type of action that is done with the right energy. So it's easy for you to do, and it's easy for the person on the other side. Because oftentimes, if we don't clear enough, for example, I work with lots of small business owners, and they first struggle to making the ask, hire me. Because if I ask the question, will you hire me? I give you the opportunity for you to say no to me. And there are these stories in my head that saying, when you say no, you're saying, I am not good enough. I am not capable. My work is not valuable. All of those things. The thing I teach, side note, the thing I teach all of my clients is when someone says no, what they're saying is, this is not the fit right now based on the information I have and the resource state that I'm in. That's what I hear in my head when someone says no to me, so I don't go into that story. So let's pretend we clear enough of this that you're able to ask the question, but you're still emotionally charged of not feeling confident about the work that you do. Or you're in a place that is so desperate because you need to make the sale to pay your bills. The person on the other end of the ask can smell fear and smell desperation no matter how much deodorant or perfume you're wearing. And subconsciously, they're going to be repelled from that. And so when doing this work, it's not just about clearing enough for me to take the action, and sometimes that's enough, but also clearing enough to take the action in an energy of being in a place that this is the right action, which makes it easier for those around me to receive, and it makes it easier for me to not write unuseful stories about the way they respond to me. Does that make sense? Okay, I have about 2 minutes left. Questions, comments, knock-knock jokes. Yeah, Anna?
To test the coherence of the person ready to take the action.
Yeah.
What would be one of your questions?
So I asked them to reimagine taking the action. I have them vivify it as much as possible, and I have them going through all of the steps. The other thing that is really useful in doing that is if they feel really, really in line with making the steps, I then will have them imagine them taking the step and having things go wrong and seeing them solve the problem. One of the problems with visualization of us just having stuff is we have the emotional charge of actually receiving what we want. Therefore, it disempowers us from taking action because I no longer have the need. Because I feel what it's like being on the beach, and that was so wonderful, and I'm just kind of zen because of that. Therefore, I take no action to move myself actually to the beach. Which is much more efficient is seeing myself taking the steps toward the action, bumping into an obstacle of some sort, overcoming that obstacle, and then having the goal. So I first have them go through doing it. The second time I'm like, great, what are 2 or 3 things that might go wrong as you do this? Okay, great. I want you to imagine encountering those obstacles. What's your strategy? Now, even though they might not bump into that exact obstacle, simply because they have practiced dealing with things not going as planned, when something that doesn't go as planned that wasn't in that catalog they came up with, they're equipped to go, okay, this isn't unusual that this didn't go perfectly. I now have resources to get by this and I can think my way through without falling into the story. Beth.
Just wondering, in this how to release it, are you actually tapping for even like questioning their beliefs about, do you have a belief that that if I let this go, you might hurt people, or you might be letting go of the people who gave it to you. So even though I might have this fear that are you tapping on this or asking them about
So I'm just tapping on those exact phrases. We actually say those exact words out loud. And if there's super resistance to one of those phrases, great. I just reach into my toolbox and go, awesome. We bump into a roadblock in the process that we need to clear before we can move forward here, and just kind of respond to that. But to begin with, we're just saying the words. I'll be here all day. Grab me at lunch. Ask me other questions. Thank you very much.
So I hope you found that useful. I'm really excited about that particular approach. And like I said in the presentation, it came directly from looking back at old client sessions I've done. It is going to be included in a new product that I'm going to be releasing later this summer, but you get a chance to take a good chunk of it absolutely free of charge in that presentation. And as I gave that presentation, I was pointing up to the projection, particularly of the tool I was teaching at the end. That's why I wasn't reading it line for line. So if you go to tappingqandapodcast.com, click on the link for episode 268, or go into the application that you are listening to this on your tablet or on your smartphone. If you go into the show notes, you'll see at the bottom of the show notes, step by step, the process we use to find the limiting belief, and step by step, the tapping we do to clear that limiting belief. Also, make sure you check out the information on the Spring Energy event, springenergyevent.com. We would love to see you there next year. Great community, awesome learning, a chance for you to do some real transformation in your life just outside of New York City. A number of people turned it into a trip and spent some time in New York City as well. So please come and join us next year. If you have a question about this or a question about anything at all, a suggestion for a guest, a topic that we need to cover in the future, I would love to hear from you. Gene, Gene, at tappingqanda.com. If you're on the website, click on the contact link. If you're inside of the Tapping Q&A app, which you can download both from the Apple and the Android app stores, click on the contact link and you will be able to send me an email or even leave me a voicemail from right inside of the app. If you don't have the app, it is the easiest way to take all over 300 audios from the archive with you, including a whole bunch of extra tapping scripts that are printed out inside of there, so you can just read them and tap along without having to listen to an audio. Free. Make sure you pick it up. You can listen to the podcast in Apple Podcasts, in Stitcher, TuneIn, Google Music Play. We are still the #1 EFT podcast in the Google Music Play store because we are still the only EFT Podcast in the Google Music Play Store. Also, iHeartRadio is a place that you can find the podcast. If you know someone in your life who would appreciate the conversation that was just shared here today, could take advantage of this teaching, please be our ambassador. Just pass it along. Don't spam your inbox and send it to everybody in the world. But it's kind of cool to think that a presentation that was given in an anonymous hotel ballroom somewhere in the middle of New Jersey is something that could become a healing force in someone's life that you know that I will never meet, and they weren't in that room. It means the world to me when you do something like that. Again, questions and comments, let me know. For the Tapping Q&A podcast, this is Gene Monterastelli. I hope you have a great day, and I will talk to you real soon. Bye-bye. The Tapping Q&A podcast is copyright Gene Monterastelli Tapping Q&A 2016. All views expressed by guests are those of the guests and not necessarily of Gene Monterastelli or Tapping Q&A.